The morning my mother tried to legally take my life from me. The courtroom smelled like old paper and floor wax. I remember that detail because I was trying to focus on anything except the woman sitting 20 feet away. The woman who had given birth to me, who had braided my hair for school pictures, who was now telling a judge I was too mentally unstable to own my own home. She spoke calmly, almost sweetly, the way she always did when she wanted something. Her voice carried that practiced warmth that had fooled teachers, neighbors, church friends, and me for most of my life. She told the judge I had been making reckless decisions. She said I was isolating myself from family guidance. She said I was vulnerable to manipulation and needed someone responsible to step in before I destroyed everything I had built. Someone responsible. She meant herself. I sat at the defendant's table with my hands pressed flat against the cold wood, watching her performance unfold. My attorney, a woman named Diane Chen, sat beside me with a folder thick enough to be a small novel. That folder contained everything. Every receipt, every bank statement, every piece of evidence that proved the truth my mother was trying to bury beneath her concerned parent act. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to pause for a moment. Think about where you are. Are you driving somewhere with the windows down? Are you washing dishes while this plays in the background? Are you lying in bed, unable to sleep, looking for a story that makes you feel less alone? I was sitting in that courtroom the day this happened, wondering how a mother could look at her own daughter and see a bank account instead of a person. Let me know in the comments what you are doing while you listen, because even now, years later, it still amazes me how quickly everything can change. The judge was a man in his early 60s, named Harold Whitmore. He had silver hair that swept back from his forehead and glasses that he adjusted every few minutes while reviewing documents. His expression gave nothing away. He could have been reading a grocery list or a death sentence with the same neutral focus. My mother's attorney, a man named Gerald Hoffman, stood beside her looking confident in a way that made my stomach turn. He had the posture of someone who believed this was a formality, a simple matter of paperwork before his client got exactly what she wanted. Behind my mother, in the gallery, sat my stepfather, Richard. He had his arms crossed over his chest, his face arranged in an expression meant to look supportive and concerned. I knew that face. I had seen it every time he wanted something from me and was preparing to be disappointed. The petition they had filed called for emergency conservatorship. Emergency. As if I were standing on the edge of a bridge instead of living a quiet, stable life in Charlotte, North Carolina. As if my paid-off townhouse and steady job and carefully managed savings were signs of a woman spiraling out of control. My mother continued speaking, her voice never wavering. She told the judge I had always struggled with decision-making. She said I was easily influenced by people who did not have my best interests at heart. She mentioned my Christmas absence like it was evidence of mental decline, rather than a choice I had made to protect myself. That Christmas. The one where I finally said no. Judge Whitmore listened without interrupting. When my mother finished, he turned to me with an expression I could not read. "Do you wish to respond?" he asked. Diane stood before I could answer. She told the judge we had extensive documentation that would directly contradict the claims made in the petition. She said the evidence would show not mental instability, but a pattern of financial manipulation by the petitioner herself. My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a scoff. Richard shifted in his seat. Hoffman's confident expression flickered for just a moment. Diane opened the folder. And that is when everything my mother had built began to crumble. To understand how I ended up in that courtroom, I need to take you back to the beginning. Not to Christmas, though that was the catalyst. Back further. Back to a childhood where love always came with conditions and control always wore the mask of concern. I grew up in a suburb outside Raleigh in a house that looked perfect from the street. White siding, green shutters, a mailbox. My mother repainted every spring to match whatever color was trending in the neighborhood. She cared deeply about appearances. She cared about what the neighbors thought, what the church congregation thought, what the other mothers at school pickup thought. What she thought about me was harder to pin down. My father left when I was 4. I have only fragmented memories of him. A deep voice, a flannel shirt, the smell of coffee in the morning. My mother never spoke about him except to say he was weak, and that weakness was contagious. She said it like a warning. After he left, she became both parents in the way that meant she made all decisions without question or input. She picked my clothes, my friends, my activities. She edited my homework before I turned it in, crossing out words she found too simple or too complicated or too something. She told me which emotions were appropriate and which were dramatic. She taught me that love meant obedience and approval had to be earned through compliance. Richard appeared when I was 11. He was a sales manager at a medical supply company. Divorced, no children of his own. My mother introduced him as a good man who would bring stability to our lives. Within a year, they were married. Within 2 years, I understood that stability meant his rules layered on top of hers. Richard believed in discipline. He believed children should be seen and not heard, productive and not frivolous, grateful and never demanding. He monitored my grades, my phone calls, my free time. If I earned anything less than an A, there were consequences. If I spent too long on a phone call with a friend, there were consequences. If I forgot to say thank you with sufficient enthusiasm, there were consequences. The consequences were never physical. They were worse in some ways. Silent treatment that lasted days, privileges removed without explanation. Lectures delivered in calm, measured tones about how disappointing I was, how much potential I was wasting, how lucky I was to have parents who cared enough to correct me. My mother always supported him. She stood beside him during lectures, nodding along, occasionally adding her own observations about my character flaws. They presented a united front against the enemy, which was apparently me. I learned to be small. I learned to anticipate what they wanted before they asked. I learned to apologize preemptively, to smooth my own edges, to become whatever shape would cause the least friction. I thought this was normal. I thought all families operated on a system of performance and reward. By high school, I had perfected the role. I got straight A's. I joined the clubs they approved of. I dated boys they selected from church families. I wore clothes they chose and held opinions they handed me. I was the perfect daughter, and in return I was tolerated. Not loved. Tolerated. There is a difference, though it took me years to understand it. The first crack appeared my senior year. I had been accepted to 3 universities, all within driving distance of home, all pre-approved by my mother as suitable. Then a 4th acceptance letter arrived. A scholarship to a school in Virginia, farther away, better ranked, offering me a chance to study something I actually wanted instead of something practical. I showed my mother the letter with trembling hands. She read it twice, then set it on the kitchen counter like it was contaminated. "Absolutely not," she said. Her voice was calm. It was always calm when she was most dangerous. I tried to explain. I told her about the program, the opportunities, the scholarship that would cover almost everything. I told her this was what I wanted. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Cold and flat, like I had become a stranger in my own kitchen. "What you want," she repeated slowly, "is not the priority. What is best for this family is the priority, and what is best for this family is for you to stay close, stay sensible, and stop being so selfish." I went to the local university. I studied business administration because she said it was practical. I lived at home for the first 2 years because she said it was responsible. I handed over half my paycheck from my part-time job because she said it was fair. I was 22 before I realized I had never made a single decision for myself. And by then, the pattern was so deep I did not know how to start digging out. The escape came slowly, in small steps I barely recognized as progress. I graduated with honors because that was expected. I got a job at a regional insurance company because it was stable and respectable. I rented an apartment 20 minutes from my mother's house because closer felt suffocating and farther felt impossible. That apartment was the first space that belonged only to me. 500 square feet of beige carpet and white walls that I was terrified to decorate because part of me still expected my mother to walk in and tell me I had chosen wrong. For the first 6 months, I slept on a mattress on the floor because buying a bed frame felt too permanent, too much like claiming something I did not deserve. But slowly, carefully, I started building a life. I made friends at work, real friends who asked my opinions and listened to my answers, and did not tell me I was being dramatic when I expressed a feeling. I started saving money in an account my mother did not know about. I bought a second-hand couch from a coworker who was moving, and when I sat on it for the first time in my own living room, I cried without understanding why. I was 25 when I bought my townhouse. A small place on a quiet street in Charlotte, far enough from Raleigh to feel like a fresh start. I saved for the down payment by eating cheap meals and skipping vacations and working overtime whenever it was offered. I handled the paperwork myself, signed the mortgage with my own name, walked through the empty rooms imagining a future that finally felt like mine. When I called my mother to tell her, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Charlotte," she repeated. "That is quite a drive." I told her I had gotten a better job there, which was true. I told her the cost of living was more reasonable, which was also true. I did not tell her that the distance was the point, that every mile between us felt like oxygen I had been denied for decades. She asked how much the townhouse cost. She asked about the mortgage terms. She asked whether I had consulted anyone before making such a significant financial decision. I had not consulted her. That was what she meant. She sighed in that way she had perfected, the sigh that conveyed disappointment and concern and judgment all at once. "I hope you know what you are doing," she said. "Because when this falls apart, I do not want to hear that you were not warned." That was her blessing. That was her congratulations. A prediction of failure delivered as maternal concern. I hung up the phone and stood in my empty townhouse, listening to the silence, and realized I did not feel sad. I felt free. The years that followed were the quietest of my life, in the best possible way. I worked. I saved. I paid down my mortgage with extra payments whenever I could manage them. I decorated my townhouse slowly, choosing each piece of furniture because I liked it, not because someone else approved. I learned to cook meals I actually enjoyed. I adopted a cat named Oliver who slept on my bed and did not care whether I met anyone's expectations. I made friends in my neighborhood, joined a book club, started running on weekends because movement made me feel alive in a way I had never experienced before. My contact with my mother settled into a predictable rhythm. Phone calls every few weeks, visits a few times a year. She always had opinions about my choices. My job was not ambitious enough. My townhouse was in the wrong neighborhood. My lack of a husband was concerning. My independence was excessive. I learned to let her words wash over me without sinking in. I nodded and changed the subject. I kept the calls short. I made excuses to avoid visits when I needed space. It was not a healthy relationship, but it was manageable. I thought I had found a balance. The balance shifted when I paid off my mortgage. I was 31. I had spent 6 years making extra payments, cutting expenses, prioritizing this one goal above everything else. The day I made the final payment, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the confirmation email for a long time. I owned my home outright. No bank, no lender, no one else had a claim to the roof over my head. I called my mother to share the news. I do not know why. Maybe some part of me still wanted her approval, still hoped she would finally see me as capable and successful. Her response was not what I expected. She asked how I had managed to pay it off so quickly. She asked about my savings, my investments, my retirement accounts. She asked questions that felt more like inventory than interest. She wanted numbers, specifics, documentation. I gave her vague answers. I said I had been careful. I said I was comfortable. I did not tell her the exact figures because something in her tone made me uneasy. She sighed again. That same sigh. "I just worry about you, Maya," she said. "You are out there all alone, making these big decisions without guidance. What if something happens? What if you make a mistake? Who would help you?" I told her I was fine. I told her I had things under control. I told her I appreciated her concern. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "Control is an illusion," she said. Remember that. I did not understand what she meant. Not then. The Christmas that changed everything arrived the following year. My mother had been calling more frequently in the months leading up to the holidays. Her tone had shifted from critical to something softer, almost pleading. She said she missed me. She said Richard missed me. She said the house felt empty without family around. I was suspicious, but I also felt guilty. I had not visited in almost a year. I had been making excuses, keeping my distance, building walls I told myself were healthy boundaries. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe she was genuinely trying to connect. I agreed to come for Christmas. I drove the 3 hours to Raleigh on Christmas Eve, my car loaded with gifts I had chosen carefully, hoping this time would be different. It was not different. The first sign was Richard at the door, his handshake too firm, his smile too wide. "Welcome home," he said, though it had not been my home for nearly a decade. The second sign was my mother's focus. She wanted to know about my finances, not how I was doing, not what was new in my life, but specifically how much I had saved, what I was investing in, whether I had made a will. I deflected. I changed the subject. I tried to steer conversations toward neutral territory, but she kept circling back. On Christmas morning, after the presents were opened and the wrapping paper cleared away, my mother asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. Richard joined us, positioning himself at the head of the table, like this was a business meeting. My mother slid a folder across the table toward me. "We have been thinking," she said, "about your future, about protecting what you have built." I opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, power of attorney forms, financial management agreements, authorization to access my accounts, my property records, my investment portfolios. My mouth went dry. "What is this?" She leaned forward with that concerned expression she had perfected over decades. "It is protection," she said. "You are out there alone with no one to help you make decisions. What if something happens to you? What if you get sick or injured? What if someone takes advantage of you? Richard and I want to make sure you are safe." I stared at the documents. My name was already printed in the blanks. All they needed was my signature. I told her I did not need this. I told her I had my own plans, my own systems, my own support. I told her I was perfectly capable of managing my own life. Her expression hardened. Just slightly, just around the edges, but I saw it. "You are being stubborn," she said. "You have always been stubborn. We are trying to help you, Maya. We are trying to make sure everything you have worked for does not disappear because you were too proud to accept guidance." Richard nodded along, adding his own thoughts. He talked about the dangers of a single woman managing significant assets alone. He mentioned stories he had heard about people being scammed, making bad investments, losing everything because they did not have proper oversight. Oversight. That was the word he used. Like I was a department that needed management. I pushed the folder back across the table. I said no. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room like water, heavy, suffocating, impossible to ignore. My mother's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, anger, calculation, and finally something cold and unfamiliar. "You are making a mistake," she said quietly. I told her it was my mistake to make. I left that afternoon. I did not stay for Christmas dinner. I drove back to Charlotte with the folder still sitting on their kitchen table, unsigned, rejected, a line drawn in sand that I knew would not be easily erased. The phone calls stopped after that. The silence stretched from days to weeks to months. I told myself it was temporary, that she was just hurt, that eventually we would find a way back to each other. I was wrong. The petition arrived in March. I found it in my mailbox on a Tuesday evening, a thick envelope with official courthouse markings. My name was printed in formal lettering. The return address was Madison County Court. I stood in my driveway holding the envelope, my heart already pounding before I opened it. Emergency petition for conservatorship. The words blurred and sharpened as I read them again and again. My mother, Patricia Diane Morrison, was petitioning the court for emergency conservatorship over my person and estate. The document claimed I was mentally unstable, emotionally volatile, prone to reckless financial decisions, and at risk of causing serious harm to myself through negligent asset management. The evidence cited included my Christmas visit. According to the petition, I had exhibited paranoid behavior, irrational responses to reasonable suggestions, and signs of emotional disturbance that caused concern for my well-being. My refusal to sign the power of attorney was listed as proof that I could not make sound decisions. My distance from family was described as isolation indicative of mental decline. My independence was framed as a symptom of instability rather than a sign of competence. I read the petition 3 times, standing in my driveway as the sun set and the street lights flickered on. I read it until I could recite the claims from memory. I read it until the shock faded and something else took its place. Not anger, not yet, something quieter and more dangerous, recognition. This was not concern, this was not protection, this was a hostile takeover, a legal mechanism to seize control of everything I had spent a decade building. My mother wanted my townhouse, my savings, my retirement accounts, my future, and she had found a way to try to take them. Diane Chen came recommended by a colleague who had gone through a similar situation. She was in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for handling family-related asset disputes with surgical precision. When I sat in her office and handed her the petition, she read it with an expression that shifted from professional neutrality to something harder. "This is predatory," she said when she finished. "The claims are vague, unsupported, and designed to create urgency where none exists. Someone coached them on how to file this." I asked what that meant. She explained that emergency conservatorship petitions were meant for people in genuine crisis. People who were truly incapable of caring for themselves. The bar for approval was supposed to be high because the consequences were severe. But some attorneys specialized in helping families file these petitions, even when they were not justified, betting that the target would be too overwhelmed or too poor to fight back. I asked what would happen if they won. Diane set down the petition and looked at me directly. "If they win," she said, "they control everything. Your bank accounts, your property, your medical decisions, your daily life. You would need their permission to spend your own money, sell your own home, make your own choices. Legally, you would be treated like a child." I felt something cold crawl down my spine. She asked if I had documentation of my financial stability. I told her I had everything. Bank statements, tax returns, employment records, the paid-off mortgage, the savings I had built dollar by dollar over years of careful living. "Good," she said, "because we are going to need all of it." Over the next few weeks, Diane and I built our case piece by piece. She taught me how conservatorship cases typically proceeded. She explained that the burden of proof was supposed to be on the petitioner, but that in practice, judges often erred on the side of caution when family members claimed concern. "We need to make it undeniable," she said. "We need to present a picture so clear that no reasonable person could look at your life and see instability." I spent evenings at my kitchen table sorting through years of paperwork. Every bank statement going back a decade, every tax return I had filed since starting my career, every performance review from work, every pay stub, every piece of documentation that proved I was a functioning, responsible adult. Diane also asked me to gather character witnesses. People who knew me, who could speak to my stability and competence. I reached out to my supervisor at work, a woman named Angela who had managed my team for 4 years. I contacted my neighbor Margaret, a retired teacher who I had helped with her garden and who had watched over my townhouse when I traveled. I asked the president of my book club, a man named Jerome, who had seen me show up consistently for 3 years of monthly meetings. Each of them agreed without hesitation. Each of them wrote statements describing a woman they knew as reliable, thoughtful, and grounded. Their words meant more to me than I had expected. I had been so focused on my family's judgment that I had forgotten there were people in my life who actually knew me, who actually saw me clearly. The weeks before the hearing became a process of excavation. Diane asked me to gather every piece of paper that proved I was capable of managing my own life. Every bank statement, every investment report, every pay stub and tax return and utility bill paid on time. I built a folder that documented a decade of responsible decisions. A mortgage paid off 6 years ahead of schedule. A savings account that had grown steadily every year. A retirement fund I had contributed to without fail since my first real job. A credit score in the excellent range. A history of financial stability, so consistent, it was almost boring. Diane also asked about my mother's financial situation. I did not know much, but I agreed to help her research public records. What we found changed everything. My mother and Richard had refinanced their home 4 times in the past 10 years. Each refinance had increased their mortgage balance instead of decreasing it. They had taken out equity loans, maxed out credit lines, accumulated debt that public records showed totaling well over $200,000. Richard's company had downsized 3 years earlier. He had taken a significant pay cut. My mother had never worked outside the home, relying entirely on his income and whatever savings they had accumulated. Their savings, based on what we could piece together from public filings and court records from a previous small claims case, appeared to be minimal or non-existent. Diane laid out the documents on her desk like a map. "They are drowning," she said. "And your townhouse is worth how much?" I told her. With the market increases over the past few years, it was worth nearly 3 times what I had paid for it. She nodded slowly. "There is your motive," she said. "They are not trying to protect you. They are trying to access your equity. If they gain conservatorship, they can legally sell your home, liquidate your assets, and use the proceeds however they choose." I sat with that information for a long time. My mother was not worried about my well-being. She was worried about her own financial survival, and she had decided that taking everything from me was preferable to asking for help. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. I wore a simple navy dress and flat shoes, clothes Diane had suggested as professional but not flashy. I wanted to look stable. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a responsible adult who had done nothing wrong. My mother was already in the courtroom when I arrived. She sat at the petitioner's table with Gerald Hoffman, her expression arranged in careful concern. Richard sat behind her in the gallery, arms crossed, watching me enter with flat eyes. I took my seat at the defendant's table. Diane opened our folder and waited. Judge Whitmore called the hearing to order. He reviewed the petition briefly, then invited my mother to present her case. She stood and spoke with practiced emotion. She described a daughter who had become distant and secretive. She talked about worrying for years as I isolated myself from family, made financial decisions without consultation, refused reasonable offers of help. She mentioned Christmas, her voice cracking slightly as she described how I had rejected their loving attempt to protect my future. She was good. I had to admit that. She had always been good at this. The concerned mother, the wounded parent, the woman who only wanted what was best for her child. When she finished, she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue and sat down. Hoffman looked satisfied. Diane stood. "Your Honor," she said, "we appreciate the petitioner's concern, but we have documentation that tells a very different story. With the court's permission, I would like to present evidence of the respondent's financial stability and the petitioner's potential motives for filing this emergency petition." Judge Whitmore nodded. "Proceed." Diane began with my bank statements. She walked through them year by year, showing consistent deposits, regular savings contributions, responsible spending patterns. She presented my mortgage history, highlighting the extra payments, the early payoff, the complete ownership of my property. She presented my employment records showing steady advancement, regular raises, positive performance reviews. She presented my credit report showing a score in the top percentile. She presented character statements from colleagues, neighbors, my book club president, all attesting to my stability and capability. As she spoke, I watched my mother's face. The concern slowly drained away, replaced by something tighter and more guarded. Richard shifted in his seat. Hoffman's confident expression began to falter. Then Diane presented the other documents, the refinance records, the debt accumulation, the financial decline that painted a very different picture of who in this courtroom was actually struggling with money management. "Your Honor," Diane said, "the petitioner claims to be concerned about the respondent's financial decisions. But public records show that the petitioner and her husband have refinanced their primary residence 4 times in 10 years, each time increasing their debt load. They currently owe more on their home than it was worth when they purchased it. They have accumulated significant unsecured debt. Meanwhile, the respondent owns her home outright, has substantial savings, and has demonstrated consistent financial responsibility for over a decade." She paused, letting the contrast settle. "The respondent's townhouse has appreciated significantly in value," she continued. "It is now worth approximately $340,000. The petitioner's mortgage debt and other liabilities exceed $240,000. It is our position that this petition is not about protecting the respondent. It is about accessing her assets to resolve the petitioner's own financial crisis. My mother stood abruptly. That is not true, she said. Her voice had lost its warmth. That is a lie. I am trying to help my daughter. I am trying to protect her from herself. Judge Whitmore raised a hand. Mrs. Morrison, please be seated. You will have an opportunity to. She did not sit. She took a step forward, her face flushing. She has always been ungrateful, she said, her voice rising. I gave her everything. I raised her alone after her father abandoned us. I sacrificed everything for her. And this is how she repays me? By turning my concern into some kind of conspiracy? Richard stood in the gallery, moving toward the low barrier that separated the seating from the council tables. Patricia, he said. Calm down. She spun toward him. Do not tell me to calm down. Do you see what they are doing? They are making me look like a criminal for caring about my own child. Judge Whitmore spoke firmly. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to take your seat immediately, or I will have you removed from the courtroom. She turned back to the judge, and I saw something in her eyes I had never seen before. Not the controlled concern, not the practiced warmth. Something raw and desperate and ugly. You do not understand, she said, her voice cracking. Everything I did was for her. Everything I sacrificed. She owes me, she owes us. After everything we did to raise her, she owes us something. The courtroom went silent. I could hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I could hear someone in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seat. I could hear my own heartbeat steady and clear as I watched my mother finally reveal who she had always been. Richard moved toward her, his face tight with alarm. Patricia, he said again, more urgently. Stop talking. She shook him off with a sharp motion. No, someone needs to say this. She has been selfish her whole life. She moved away from us, she stopped calling, she built this little life for herself like we did not matter, and now she has everything while we struggle. How is that fair? How is that right? Gerald Hoffman was on his feet now, trying to intervene. Your Honor, my client is clearly emotional. If we could have a brief recess. Judge Whitmore held up a hand. No recess. I have heard enough. My mother turned toward me then, and for the first time in the entire proceedings she looked directly into my eyes. The mask was completely gone. What I saw underneath was not the mother I had spent my life trying to please. It was a stranger. A woman who saw me not as her daughter, but as an obstacle between herself and what she wanted. You were supposed to take care of us, she said. Her voice dropped to something almost like a hiss. That is what children do. They take care of their parents when the time comes. But you just ran away and built your little kingdom and left us with nothing. I did not respond. There was nothing to say. Everything I had suspected, everything I had feared, everything I had been too afraid to fully acknowledge was now out in the open. This was never about my well-being. It was never about concern. It was about entitlement so deep that she genuinely believed my success belonged to her. A bailiff stepped forward, positioning himself near my mother. Judge Whitmore spoke with quiet authority. Mrs. Morrison, one more outburst and you will be removed from this courtroom. Is that understood? She stared at him for a long moment, her chest heaving. Then something in her seemed to collapse. Her shoulders dropped. Her face went slack. She let Gerald Hoffman guide her back to her seat, and she sat down heavily, staring at the table in front of her. The courtroom remained silent. Richard had retreated back to the gallery, his face pale. Hoffman was shuffling papers, trying to regain some composure, and my mother sat motionless, finally exposed, finally seen for exactly what she was. I looked at Diane beside me. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. This was what she had predicted might happen. She had told me that people who file predatory petitions often cannot maintain their composure when the evidence turns against them. She had told me that the truth tends to surface when the performance becomes too difficult to sustain. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat and began to speak. My mother stood there, breathing hard, finally exposed. Not a concerned parent, not a protective mother. A woman who believed her child was a debt to be collected. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with something like disappointment. I have reviewed the petition and the evidence presented by both parties, he said. The petition claims the respondent is mentally unstable and incapable of managing her own affairs. The evidence shows the exact opposite. The respondent has demonstrated consistent financial responsibility over many years. The respondent owns significant assets outright. The respondent has no history of erratic behavior or poor decision-making. He paused, looking directly at my mother. However, he continued, the petitioner and her spouse have demonstrated significant financial distress. The timing of this petition, filed shortly after the respondent declined to grant power of attorney over her assets, raises serious concerns about motive. My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. The petition for emergency conservatorship is denied, Judge Whitmore said. Furthermore, I am referring this matter for review to determine whether the petition was filed in bad faith. If the review finds that the petitioner knowingly made false claims to gain control of another adult's assets, there may be additional legal consequences. He closed the folder. This court is adjourned. My mother did not look at me as she left the courtroom. Richard followed her, his hand on her elbow, steering her toward the exit. Gerald Hoffman gathered his papers with quick, frustrated movements. I stayed seated for a long moment, letting the reality sink in. I had won. They had tried to take everything from me, and they had failed. Diane touched my shoulder. Are you okay? I nodded, though I was not sure if okay was the right word. I felt empty, hollowed out, like something had been removed from inside me that I had not even known was there. We walked out of the courthouse into pale winter sunlight. The air was cold but clean, and I stood on the steps breathing it in, feeling the weight of what had just happened. My mother had called me unstable. She had called me incapable. She had tried to reduce me to a problem to be managed, an asset to be claimed. And in the end, she had revealed herself instead. Everything I sacrificed, she owes me. Those words echoed in my head as I drove home. They echoed as I walked through my front door. They echoed as I sat on my couch with Oliver purring in my lap, staring at the walls of the home no one could take from me. I had spent my whole life trying to earn my mother's love, trying to be good enough, compliant enough, successful enough to finally receive the approval I craved. And in that courtroom, I learned the truth I had been avoiding for decades. Her love had never been available. It had always been conditional on control. And when I slipped out of her grip, she did not grieve the relationship. She tried to reclaim the asset. The months after the hearing were quiet in a way that felt earned. The bad faith review proceeded slowly, eventually resulting in a formal finding against my mother and a requirement that she pay a portion of my legal fees. It was not a large amount, but it was documented. Official. A permanent record of what she had tried to do. I attended one final meeting at the courthouse to receive the formal notice of the finding. The document was clinical and precise. It stated that the petition had lacked substantive merit, and that the timing and circumstances suggested an attempt to misuse the conservatorship process for financial gain. I read those words several times. Financial gain. Not concern, not protection, not love. Financial gain. Diane had told me this was actually a significant outcome. Most bad faith reviews resulted in dismissal with a warning. An actual finding against the petitioner was rare and would follow my mother through any future legal proceedings. If she ever tried something like this again, against me or anyone else, the court would already have a record of her behavior. I thanked Diane and left the courthouse. I sat in my car for a long time before driving home, watching people come and go through the glass doors. Lawyers with briefcases. Families dressed for hearings. Ordinary people navigating the machinery of law that most of us never expect to encounter. I had never imagined I would be one of them. I had never imagined I would sit across a courtroom from my own mother, defending my right to own my life. My mother and I did not speak. She did not call to apologize. She did not reach out to explain. The silence between us stretched into something permanent, and I let it. For the first few months, I expected her to make contact. A letter, maybe. A phone call in the middle of the night. Some attempt to repair or explain or manipulate, but the silence held. And gradually, I realized she had nothing left to say. Her words in the courtroom had been her final statement. She owes me. That was her truth, and no apology could walk that back. I heard through distant relatives that she and Richard had eventually sold their house to pay down their debts. They moved into a smaller place, a rental. Their financial situations stabilized, but diminished. I did not feel satisfaction when I learned this. I did not feel vindication. I felt only a distant sadness for the relationship we might have had if she had ever seen me as a person, instead of an extension of herself. Sometimes I wondered what she told people about what happened, whether she had crafted a new narrative where she was the victim and I was the ungrateful daughter who had turned on her. Whether she had found a way to reshape the truth into something she could live with. I decided it did not matter. Her story was hers to tell. The court record existed. The truth was documented. Whatever version she presented to church friends or distant relatives or anyone else, the facts remained unchanged. My brother Marcus reached out about 6 months after the hearing. We had never been close. He was 5 years younger, the golden child who had always played by their rules. But something had shifted in him too. He called on a Sunday afternoon while I was reading on my porch. His voice sounded different than I remembered, quieter, more uncertain. He said he had been thinking about reaching out for months, but had not known what to say. He told me he had started to see things differently. He said watching the court proceedings, reading the documents that became public record, had forced him to look at our childhood with new eyes. He was not ready to cut ties with our mother, but he understood why I had. He wanted to rebuild something with me, if I was willing. I told him I was willing to try. We met for coffee in a neutral city, halfway between Charlotte and Raleigh. We talked for 3 hours, sharing memories we had never compared, patterns we had both normalized, wounds we had carried alone. He told me things I had never known. Times our mother had used the same tactics on him. Expectations that had shaped his choices in ways he was only beginning to understand. A lifetime of performing the role of the good son while feeling, underneath it all, like he was never quite enough. We were not close after that first conversation. But we were connected in a way we had never been before. Two people who had survived the same storm, finally comparing notes. It was the beginning of something new. Not a replacement for what I had lost, but something genuine, something built on honesty instead of performance. I still live in my townhouse. I still have my job, my savings, my quiet routines. I still drink coffee on my porch and read books with my cat and run on weekend mornings when the weather is clear. But something fundamental has changed. I no longer carry the weight of trying to earn love that was never truly offered. I no longer measure myself against standards designed to keep me small. I no longer apologize for being independent, capable, and complete without anyone's oversight. Sometimes I think about that courtroom, about the moment my mother's mask finally cracked, about the words that spilled out when she lost control. She owes me. That was what she really believed, that raising me was an investment she was entitled to collect, that my success belonged to her because she had suffered in my creation, that my boundaries were theft and my independence was betrayal. I used to wonder if things could have been different. If I had signed those papers at Christmas, would we still have a relationship? Would she call me sometimes just to talk? Would we share holidays and birthdays and ordinary moments? The answer, I finally understood, was no, because the relationship she wanted was not a relationship at all. It was ownership. And ownership is not love. If you are listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, I want you to know something important. You are not obligated to be owned by the people who raised you. You are not selfish for building a life they cannot control. You are not unstable for refusing to hand over your autonomy. Some parents see their children as extensions of themselves, resources to be managed, investments to be collected. When those children grow up and become independent adults, those parents feel robbed of something they believe they were owed. But you do not owe anyone your freedom. Not your savings, not your home, not your choices, not your future. You earned those things. They belong to you. My mother tried to take everything from me. She filed legal documents claiming I was mentally unfit to own my own life. She sat in a courtroom and told a judge I needed to be managed. And when the judge read the evidence, the truth came out. Not my instability, but her desperation. Not my recklessness, but her entitlement. Not my unfitness, but her willingness to destroy me to save herself. I walked out of that courtroom with everything I had walked in with. My home, my savings, my dignity, my future. She walked out with a public record of what she had tried to do. A finding of bad faith that will follow her through any future legal proceedings. A permanent documentation of the moment her mask finally fell. Some people call that karma. I call it consequences. The last time I saw my mother was in that courtroom. Her face flushed, her voice cracking, her careful performance finally shattered. She owes me. Those words taught me more about our relationship than 30 years of living with her ever had. They showed me who she really was beneath the concern and the criticism and the conditional warmth. I do not hate her. Hate requires too much energy, too much ongoing attention. I simply do not engage with her anymore. She exists somewhere outside my life, dealing with the consequences of her choices, and I exist here in my home, surrounded by things I built with my own hands, living a life no one can take from me. Last Christmas was the first holiday I spent entirely on my own terms. I did not drive to Raleigh. I did not sit through tense dinners or loaded conversations. I did not perform gratitude or absorb criticism or shrink myself to fit someone else's expectations. Instead, I woke up in my own home. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the frost on the grass melt in the morning sun. I called Marcus, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular. I read a book. I took a long walk through my neighborhood and waved at neighbors I had come to know over the years. In the afternoon, I went to my friend Angela's house for dinner. She had invited me when she learned I would be spending the holiday alone. Her family welcomed me like I had always belonged there. Her children showed me their presence. Her husband poured me wine and told terrible jokes. Her mother asked about my work and actually listened to the answer. I sat at their table surrounded by warmth I had not earned through performance or compliance. Warmth that was offered freely, without conditions, without invisible invoices. And I understood, maybe for the first time, what family could feel like when it was built on connection instead of control. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough by the people who should have loved you without conditions, remember this. Silence can be protection. Distance can be healing. And sometimes the loudest revenge is simply living a life they cannot control. Thank you for listening to my story. Tell me in the comments where you are while you hear this, because it still amazes me how these stories find the people who need them. And if you are in the middle of your own battle with someone who believes they own you, know this. The truth always comes out eventually. Sometimes in a courtroom, sometimes in a quiet moment of recognition, sometimes in the echo of words spoken without the mask. And when it does, you will finally be free.